All right. Well, the party has come away from its roots a fair bit in recent times over things like the Middle East conflict. Do you think that could cost you at the election?
Our party has always had four key principles, one of which is peace and non-violence, and we have stuck true to that principle. I mean, it was the Australian Greens that opposed the Iraq War, bravely opposed the Iraq War, both. It was the Australian Greens that have been consistent in supporting the rights of the people of Palestine to self-determination, but this has been consistent. I mean, I've been talking about the rights of the Palestinian people since I first got elected in state parliament. We have been absolute, and we will continue to be consistent on that. Peace and non-violence is core principles.
What did you think of Tony Burke's statements about Netanyahu and the arrest warrant?
Well, I mean, I like politicians who answer questions, and he did everything he possibly could to stick to this hollow formula that Penny Wong has had, that we comply with international law, we respect the court. If you respect the court and you comply with international law and they've issued an arrest warrant, you enforce the arrest warrant. Simple as that. Why can't he say it? Why can't Penny Wong say it?
Well, why can't they?
Because they are just caught in this sort of middle of the road, a bit of each side. You can't be a bit of each. You can't be, on the one hand this and on the other hand that with an arrest warrant. The court's issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, as well as a Hamas leader and another member of the Netanyahu cabinet. And if they come into Australia, we have a legal obligation to effect those arrest warrants. Just say it.
Or get out of the court, right?
Yeah, or get out of the court. Or don't pretend that you're going to comply with international law but not enforce an arrest warrant.
You don't think they would enforce it?
Well, I think they are, again, caught in this horrible mess where they're largely responding to US foreign policy, and we've seen that time and time again. That they only say, really, what the US permits them to say. The US has said that they don't want to enforce this. Awkwardly, we for their purposes, we're a party to the treaty. We have a treaty obligation to actually enforce the warrant, and they don't know what to do. They're in a mess.
What about this Eilert Sharkhead case, the refusal of her visa?
Well, that was the right thing to do. I mean, that was absolutely the right thing to do. And I listened to the minister, and I think he made it very clear why he did it, and I support that decision.
The Greens opposed the social media ban age of 16, I'm pretty sure, didn't you? Why did you oppose that? Because
it won't work. Because we think it's absolutely the wrong policy. We should be making the platform safe, and making the platform safe not just for kids who are under 16, but for all of us. And look, there was a ridiculous inquiry, one morning's inquiry, but pretty much every expert that came forward said this is actually bad, particularly for isolated kids in regional parts of the country. It can be, particularly for some of those kids, the only way they get some social connection. They say it won't work. They say that we should be making the platform safe. And then we have these bizarre positions from the government that if, kids are using a VPN, they're going to somehow force platforms to check every global user to ensure that no one's got a VPN. I mean, this is a policy that will unravel as the blowtorch of reality is pushed to it over the next 12 months.
You don't think it'll ever come into effect?
Well, I just can't see how it could work unless they're going to insist on every Australian having facial recognition or some kind of ID or a mix of two. I mean, and I think that's one of the other fundamental reasons why we opposed it. If you're checking to see someone's 13, 14, 15 or 16, then you're checking to see everybody's age, and you have to do that. And I had an exchange with the department, a couple of weeks ago in estimates, and they made it very clear. You can't just check the age of kids. You're checking the age of everyone. And do millions of Australians really want all of these social media platforms catching their biometric data, catching their facial recognition data and holding it for them? I don't.
Gambling advertising reform, why do you think the PM's put the brakes on that?
I mean, just, again, surrendering to industry. And we've seen multiple points where he's surrendered to industry in the last week, not least the EPA legislation, and a complete lack of ticker. I mean, this is a Prime Minister who has shrunk in office. And if you wanted a key example about how he shrunk in office, look what he did on gambling. One of his own prominent former members said this is a national crisis. We need a national ban on gambling ads. And he has failed to deliver.
Government sources have told me when it came to the creation of a federal environmental agency, your demands were too great. You wanted a climate trigger. You wanted an end to native forestry. Why didn't you just go with the government's legislation as it was? It was something, I guess.
Well, I mean, if you followed through those negotiations, and I'm sure you did, we wanted a climate trigger. It's not just us. Pretty much every environmental NGO wanted a climate trigger. It became very clear that we weren't going to get a climate trigger. So we moderated our demands, and indeed the last package, which was pretty much signed off between the portfolio minister and the sector and us, was to actually put some constraints on native forest logging and to reinstate some Commonwealth oversight of native forest logging, which would have been a real win for forests in New South Wales and Tasmania. Pretty much sorted. And then at the last minute, the fossil fuel industry comes in, meets the Prime Minister, he rolls over, they tickle his belly, and the whole deal's knocked off.
You did get quite a bit of legislation through, though, I've got to say. You came to a deal with Mark Dreyfus on privacy legislation. Talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, this is called Tranche 1. There's a lot of Tranche 1s, Tranche 2s. The real reason we wanted to get this legislation through on privacy is not so much to deal with Tranche 1, which is some pretty modest changes, like there's a new tort, legal action if there's a serious breach of privacy. There's a chance for a children's online safety code, although how that interacts with the social media ban, we'll find out next year. So there was a few small good things in this, but mainly we needed to get this sorted so as we can get on to the next round of privacy reforms, which is going to be protecting your data, protecting our kids' data, and we really needed to get this off the table to get to Tranche 2 because, you know, I'm glad we got this through, but it does bugger all, to be honest. And we want to get into the real meat and potatoes next year.
The plan to levy a higher super tax on those with more than $3 million in their accounts. Why on earth would the Greens oppose that?
Well, it's not that we oppose that. We just say...
You didn't pass it.
Well, I mean, there were 31 laws passed, so there are a whole bunch of negotiations going forward. We would like to see a far more progressive tax in superannuation. I mean, superannuation tax concessions are costing us, well, over the lifetime of superannuation, are going to cost us pretty much the same as running the pension. Superannuation tax concessions are overwhelmingly to the wealthy. We'd love to see
Isn't this a start then?
That. Yeah, well, it's a tiny, modest start, and we're pushing the government to try and get further, and we would like to see that rebalanced so that we don't give these huge tax concessions to people who are already incredibly wealthy. I mean, you will say, there aren't endless government funds to go around. Should we really be giving tax concessions to people, you know, with like $2.5 million in their super balance?
When do you think an election will be? Are you pretty convinced it'll be a hung parliament? And how do you feel about giving confidence and supply to either side? Well, presumably Labor would be the only one who'd accept it from the Greens.
We will never give confidence and supply to the coalition and Peter Dutton. Their policy platform, their record in government, you know, is anathema to me, and I know it's anathema to our supporters and our parties. That's just not going to happen. The question will be if there's a minority government, and we will be campaigning as hard as we can, together with millions of Australians who have been grossly disappointed by this government and the previous one, for a minority government. And that will, I think, create a whole bunch of new dynamics. I think it'll make Parliament work. It'll mean legislation in both houses has to pass a merits test, which would be nice. And it will potentially give the chance for the Parliament to restore some of its traditional powers. There's probably a pretty sort of arcane debate for a Sunday morning, but the executive has really been running our government. You know, the Labor gets in, the coalition gets in, the ministers and the executive have been running the Commonwealth government almost unhindered by Parliament. It'd be lovely to see Parliament actually having its job back and holding the government to account in both houses.
Do you want a carbon tax back?
Well, I mean, we would love to see some action on climate change, some real action on climate change. The latest figures that came out have shown emissions actually rising under this government compared to the Morrison government. We know that the current policy settings are not working. We know that this is a government that's approved 28 new coal and gas projects. So absolutely, do we want to see action on climate change? We do.
David Shoebriddge, thanks so much for your time.
Cheers, Andrew.